Thank you for joining me on this webinar about saturated buffers. I am Keegan Kalt, the Executive Director with the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition. This webinar is one of 6 webinars that is brought to you by CTIC in agreement with ADMC. This came about through a grant with the EPA to train ag consultants to equip them with resources to really be able to advise on the benefits and where these conservation drainage practices will work in the landscape. The other 5 webinars are impacts on drainage on crop production, denitrifying bioreactors, drainage water management, navigating the NRCS, then a special case study on conservation drainage delivery. We hope that you take a look at the other 5 webinars in addition to this one, but we will review a little bit from some of the other webinars within this one, just so you can get a feel for what they all talk about. What you will learn today, first and foremost, what is a saturated buffer? Where do these saturated buffers work? That design criteria that's needed to facilitate the design of the practice, how they are installed, and then a little on the cost effectiveness of the practice. Stepping back, a little background on the Agricultural Drainage Management Coalition. We are an industry-led coalition. Our members include the tile manufacturers and distributors, the engineers that design these practices, the land improvement contractor association out there, the contractors themselves, commodity organizations, and others in the ag industry that are interested in seeing these practices move forward. Our mission is pretty simple. We're that partnership. We're really looking to find practical solutions that improve our crop production systems while also improving the environmental outcome of those crop production systems through managing the drainage systems involved. So not only do we find practical practices, but we try to find ways to speed the implementation of those practices once we feel confident in them. To review what the benefits of tile drainage are, in case you missed that first webinar, tile drainage really gives us that confidence that we'll have that planting window that we want to see in the spring. It dries that soil out to allow us to get out in that field earlier, warms that soil up. On the same side that we get that earlier planting window and better planting conditions, it also gives us better harvest conditions, decreases the chance for compaction associated with that heavier harvesting equipment by having that dry soil involved. On the risk mitigation side of things, tile drainage really decreases the risk of crop damage due to excessive moisture and precipitation. If you take a look at the crop insurance payout through RMA on any given year, excessive moisture and precipitation is usually one of the top 2. It's usually between excessive moisture and precipitation, or if it's a drought year. Actually, some of the water management practices we talk about within this series can help mitigate drought issues as well. Being such a effective risk mitigation tool, we are seeing a lot of farmers investing dollars into pattern tile systems moving forward. The next area that they really benefit, that we're really starting to see more data come out on, is actually improving the nitrogen use efficiency. So they're finding that drained landscapes versus undrained, drained actually has better nitrogen use efficiency. That means it takes less amount of nitrogen to grow the same amount of crop, or that same amount of nitrogen would grow more crop. And also they're finding that it reduces that year-to-year variability on what would have that optimum nitrogen application rate be. We know it's never consistent where year in, year out, 150 pounds of N per acre is going to work. It really depends on the weather system that year. But with a drainage system, it does make that more predictable and reduces that amount of variability. So with that improved nitrogen use efficiency and management recommendations, we can actually decrease the amount of fertilizer that's needed to grow that optimum crop. This decreases the amount of energy needed to produce that crop, because producing artificial nitrogen fertilizer is a very energy intensive process. It also becomes more energy efficient with we have those drier soils, so there's not that slippage out there in the field when we're moving equipment through. All these factors really lead to increased profitability. Once again, that's why we're seeing more and more farmers choosing to invest in tile drainage, and that profitability obviously also comes back and increases that land value for the landowner. With all the benefits of drainage systems. There's also unintended consequences. So leaky nutrients, especially dissolved nutrients such as nitrate and dissolved phosphorus, can be transported. If there's water to get down into the pipes, into the tiles, they can be transported off-site down into surface waters. So really those resource concerns pop up at every level. So at the farm level, if you're watering livestock, either a stream, an ag-dominated stream, or if you have wells for your rural resident, that well water can become contaminated. Also locally, if the drinking water source for communities downstream get it from a surface water or shallower groundwater, there can be issues if it's an ag-dominated watershed with high nitrate concentration. So we're trying to figure out solutions to lower the amount of nitrogen leaving the farm. So that's why we work with these conservation drainage practices. And then regionally to where they get the national attention, the Gulf of Mexico hypoxia zone that creates the dead zone down there, which hurts fisheries. Also areas like the Chesapeake Bay and the TMDL that they're working with over in the Delmarva area with conservation drainage practices. These are all really driving the need to speed up the implementation of these practices. If you've seen some of my other webinars, you'll see I always present this slide, just in case anybody missed the previous one. But this is a slide developed by Dr. Mike Castellano. That red line represents the soil nitrate production from that organic material in our soils. And the green line represents when our crop systems utilize nitrogen or nitrate in their growing cycles. So you can see those two peaks don't line up. If those two peaks did line up perfectly, we wouldn't be seeing the nitrogen problems that we're seeing today. Instead, that distance between those two peaks really represents when we're at risk for losing nitrates out of the system, especially if there's water involved. So you can see here that red line peaks late spring, early summer. And that's when a lot of our tiles experience a lot of water flow. And so there is a concern there about how do we mitigate some of that risk. When we think about the bend of production in the environment, once again, there's that overlap of where conservation drainage is going to work, where it'll actually improve or maintain those production systems while also improving those environmental outcomes that we want to see. The conservation drainage practices that I work with on a daily basis would be the drainage water management, bioreactors, which we have webinars on, saturated buffers, sub-irrigation, also drainage water recycling is another form of irrigation that we're seeing with drainage systems right now. Constructed wetlands are sometimes referred to as water quality wetlands. And then a little bit larger scale, the two-stage ditch systems, where we can get some environmental benefits from making the drainage ditches replicate a little bit more natural instances out there on the landscape. And then also multi-purpose oxbows, where we actually use old abandoned oxbows, go excavate that material, make that oxbow active again, and we can introduce tile water into it if it's nearby, and we actually get that denitrification happening within those oxbows, and they almost act like miniature wetlands for us. So what is a saturated buffer? Well, it is an edge of field tile treatment practice which diverts tile flow to lateral lines that run parallel to the stream and allows nitrogen to be processed and pulled out of the system through that carbon that's available in that riparian soil profile. So some people think that the nitrogen is getting removed by whatever vegetation is in that filter strip. It's really that soil carbon that's bringing most of that denitrification, pulling most of that nitrogen out of the system. We get that high carbon material, create anaerobic conditions where those microbes need something else to breathe to process the food that they're eating. If there's no longer oxygen available, they start going to nitrate, and it reduces that nitrate to N2 gas. So where do these saturated buffers work? The placement of these really on the main that we'll be treating, you want to have some grade on that main. If it's an extremely flat site, the impact area kind of behind the saturated buffer is generally too much for the farmer to want to maybe risk having water back up into the field. So if we have some grade on that main, it works really well. We need soil carbon available to process the nitrogen. So we need a minimum of 1.2% organic material in the top 2.5 feet of soil to meet NRCS recommendation. They probably will be looking to see if we can get by with less, because that number was just kind of pulled out for the first saturated buffers that went in the ground. But now that the practice is a little bit more established, we'll be taking a look to see if we really need that high percentage of organic matter or not. But that's something that we need to check when doing site visits to make sure that the practice will work the way we intend it to. Then next, we need at least 30 feet of vegetation between the stream bank and where our distribution line is. So we need that permanent vegetation to be able to site the practice. Ideally be a little bit wider than that at least, just so you have a little bit of more room to play with and have that distribution pipe maybe further away from that field edge. That always works better the more distance we have between the distribution pipe and the field edge. Then next we need the absence of a high conductivity soil. So that just means we don't want to find any sand layers, sand lenses, gravel layers. A lot of times if you're working next to larger river systems, it's going to be too much gravel and sand in that riparian zone. But if you're working on those smaller first and second order streams up in the watershed, you can make it work. But you do have to check not only what does the soil survey say for that area and that soil type, but you need to go out and pull soil cores to verify that you're not going to be hitting those sand pockets. Then you need to find signs of a restrictive layer. Basically, you don't want to lose the water out the bottom. You can look at soil survey values on this or pull some deeper soil cores to make sure that you're going to be able to hold that water table. And then you don't want to have an abundance or a presence of abandoned drain pipes. Basically, you need to know what's going on within that distribution area. If there's another outlet in that area, you'll probably need to tie it into your saturated buffer. You don't want to just push all the water from one outlet that has a distribution line in that soil profile to the next outlet over, where there's no control structure on it and all the water is just going to eventually get into that tile line and just drain out before it has a chance to be treated. So taking another step at looking at the saturated buffer site selection, that site on the left is what I mentioned, having that grade on that main. Ideally, you come in from that field edge into that filter strip, and that filter strip has some elevation to it dropping down to the stream. That's the ideal site. Sites like that, you'll be able to just kind of set your control structure up based on the designs and kind of put it out there and forget that it's there. Just let it do its work. It's really just a modified outlet at that point in time. You're not going to have much impact, if any impact, back on the production side of things. Maybe if it's an extremely wet year, you'd want to go out there and manage that, but for the most part, you'd be okay. If it's a flatter site, you can work with those sites. That's more of a managed saturated buffer, where the farmer or landowner is going to have to commit to going out there 3 to 4 times throughout the year to change those stopboard settings, which really aren't too hard or difficult to do. It's just a matter of you need to put those stopboards back in place to be able to get that treatment involved. They also probably likely aren't quite as effective as the ideal sites in that we don't have that grade to push that water through the system. And if that water table comes up and sits there, it's a missed opportunity for treatment. But if the farmer's interested, you can make a managed site work as long as they know that they will need to be actively taking care of that site. Once again, looking at suitable versus unsuitable sites. Unsuitable, not much organic matter. We don't get that nice 2.5 feet of organic matter at that 1.2%. Or we find that coarse gravel layer down below where all that water is just going to drop off and drop below the treatment area, and we can't actually get it up into that organic material that will spur on that denitrification. So you want to find that impermeable layer down there. You want to find evidence of that, the ability to hold a water table. And once again, you can refer to the soil survey on this, but if you do have the opportunity to take some deep cores out there, evidence of that glade material, that you see those iron oxide deposits there, that's a good indication that that water table is seasonally high. You can find some other evidence of that. Then you can use that to justify building a saturated buffer. Design criteria, really, once again, similar to bioreactors. If you saw the bioreactor webinar, you need to know that size and material of the main as well as the grade of that main. But in addition to that, to knowing those characteristics of the main, we do need to know that stream profile. So kind of where's that expected water line at? Where's that water table going to be at most points in time during the year, as well as Do we have actively eroding stream banks, or are they pretty stable? We also need to know the gradient along the buffer and that field edge. We need to know if we're losing too much elevation too quickly and our distribution line is going to, come out of the ground or be too shallow. And how long can we run that distribution line if we are changing elevations relatively quickly? And then you do need to pull soil cores along your treatment area to make sure you have a good idea of what's going on underneath the ground. Make sure that you don't have those sand lenses or gravel layers. If you do find some that's suspicious, you can work with your NRCS and they can come out and have their soil scientists come out and do more cores for you to help you determine if the site's a go or no go or not. Sometimes if you find some pockets, you can do things like put in a section of non-perforated pipe as your distribution line and just kind of skip that area for a treatment area and go further away from it. Next, that treatment area. Once again, it's really that soil profile between that field edge and that stream. So it looks something like this. Generally we want to see at least 500 feet of distribution line. Oftentimes get up to 1,000 feet of distribution line with these saturated buffers, and that minimum 30 foot width is very important to get that treatment. Truthfully, most of our treatment happens probably within the first 10 to 15 feet of the distribution line, but staying back 30 feet leaves any concern about maybe creating pressure on an eroding stream bank. So we're not going to be trading off, maybe a water quality issue with nitrates to maybe a water quality issue of sediments from an eroding stream bank, as long as we stay 30 feet back. So treatment area continued here. That gradient is more important than treatment length or even treatment width. So we do want to see that good grade. The H1 and H2 that you see there. So the H2 would be kind of that water line, the stream that you find out when you take that stream profile. H1 is kind of the height of where you're going to have your distribution line at, or the height that you're setting your stop logs at within your control structure. And that really creates the gradient to push water through your system. If those two kind of level off, if that length in between the two becomes too long, you actually lose that gradient. So even if you have a 100-foot buffer, it's not advantageous to put your distribution line 90 feet back from that stream edge, because then you lose that gradient and you actually can't push as much water through the system. So keep closer to that 30-foot number generally work much better, because then you have that higher gradient and you'll be able to push more water in and out of that system. And like I mentioned before, you really only need about 10 to 15 feet to get adequate denitrification. And by staying closer to that stream edge, you eliminate or reduce some of the concerns with backing water up into the production area of the field. If you do have that 100-foot buffer, but you got 60 feet between that distribution line and the buffer, or the distribution line and that field edge, that's just more buffer between the two, where we're not going to be backing water up into the production area of the field. Our saturated buffer installs, pretty simple process. It's really only about a 4-hour process from start to finish, maybe even less once you get the hang of it. The first thing that you do is really you just set the control structure in there. It is important to make sure that control structure is level. The one in this picture was actually for a research site. So it's a bigger control structure. It has 4 chambers on that, and that's really just to do advanced flow monitoring on it. The control structures and typical field installations are going to be smaller. But with that control structure, you do put sections of non-perforated pipe. Generally, actually, we just run non-perf pipe for the outlet all the way down to whatever our outlet material is going to be. And then, 10 to 20 feet on the upstream side of that control structure, you also need to replace that main with non-perforated pipe, just so we're not getting water to flow around the control structure. Also, that third picture, you see we do put an anti-seep collar about 15 feet up from the control structure, just to prevent that water, once again, from flowing around the control structure, creating some erosion problems. The distribution line installation, its pull behind plows work really well for it. You run that distribution line parallel to the stream, once again 30 feet away from that stream bank edge, or maybe a little bit more than that. But really, you don't need the the big tile plows out there. These ones are a little bit more nimble and pretty quick. And honestly, it's pretty expensive for contractors to want to mobilize those bigger tile plows. So these pull behind work great. You can set the grade on that with your GPS system. See if I can get the video to play. Just a quick video here of this pull behind plow doing its job. Yeah, you can see it doesn't take too long to get up to 1,000 feet of distribution line installed. If you're having field days for this, that generally goes pretty quick. That's kind of the more exciting part to see, is watch the line get plowed in. But once again, you probably spend most of your day setting that control structure, digging down on that outlet, uncovering the outlet all the way to the stream edge, because you're replacing it with non-perf pipe and a new actual outlet material, and then placing upstream 15 to 20 feet of that perforated tile with non-perforated section. You can see also using these tile plows, they really don't create very much disturbance, which is very nice. The reseeding efforts on this, you do just follow generally whatever the CRP plan for the area was. Around the control structure, there is quite a bit of disturbance, but then the actual distribution line themselves, it's not very much disturbance, and that is a question you'll get from landowners. How serious of a job is it to get this reseeded? And it's actually a fairly simple process. How cost effective are these practices? In Iowa, looking at some of our Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship data, the average cost of installation is about $5,800 for a saturated buffer. So once again, very cost effective. That's why when we go out there and work with farmers and landowners on these practices, we actually recommend doing a saturated buffer first if it works, compared to installing a bioreactor, because bioreactors cost more money up front, and then also they need to have those wood chips replaced in 10 to 15 years. Whereas a saturated buffer is really just doing work out there as long as that filter strip, that 30 feet of vegetation in place. In terms of cost per pound of N removed, $1 to $3 per pound of N removed is kind of the ballpark range for saturated buffers, which once again, very cost effective, especially when you compare it to other nitrogen removing practices that are available to us. This practice is very exciting. Actually, we find a lot of landowners are very interested in it just because it is such an easy practice. As long as you don't have those sites that need that intensive management schedule, where they can just go out there, set these control structures, let them do its work, and kind of forget that they're there. And really, a lot of farmers and landowners just think of this as a modified outlet. It's barely even a new practice to them. It's just kind of working with their existing tile system. And so we do find that they are willing to do it. Impact of the practice, once again, looking at the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy documentation, looking at saturated buffers, very, very effective at that nitrogen load reduction, about 50% removal rate on average. I always stress the importance of not only looking at percent of load reduction, but also the overall amount of load reduction. Don't get nervous if you install a saturated buffer. Maybe those numbers aren't quite as high as 50%. A lot of times that just means you're treating more water and more nitrogen in the long run if you have a lower load reduction percentage. And that's just because you have more nitrogen to begin with. And so, if you're on those bigger systems, maybe 80 acres coming into it, 100 acres coming into it, and it's an 8-inch main, you might only be treating 20 to 30% of the load, but that's a much higher amount of nitrogen than if you're on a 6-inch line that's only draining 20 acres and you're seeing a 70% load reduction. You're probably treating 3 times as much nitrogen on that larger system. Here's a video produced by the Soil Water Conservation Society. That's part of their media resource library, their conservation media library. Does a great job of giving a general overview of these saturated buffers. And once again, it's a visual. You see the installation happening. It really helps people understand what the practice looks like and how it works. So I'm going to switch my audio over here, and then we'll take a look at this.
Saturated buffers is probably our newest tool for removing nutrients, especially nitrate, from tile drainage water before those nitrates get discharged into our surface waters. A saturated buffer is essentially our attempt to take a riparian buffer that may already be in place and make it perform better as far as removing nutrients from the water. In a tile drained landscape, typically we take our tile drainage and route it right through those riparian buffers. What a saturated buffer does then is intercept some of that tile drainage and inject it as shallow groundwater along the top of the buffer. And as that water then moves through as shallow groundwater, we get denitrification taking place, which removes the nitrate before it can get to the stream. So what we do is we intercept the outlet as it crosses the buffer. We put it in a control box. And what that box essentially is a shallow dam. We can raise the water table at that point, and as we do that, then we can distribute water down a new tile that we install along the top of the buffer.
Putting in the saturated buffer strip isn't that expensive. Our main job is to locate the main tile outlet, put in the stop log box, which takes about an hour, run 500 to 1,000 feet of tile at a zero elevation to accept the water and saturate the buffer strip, and that's all there is to it.
What we've seen so far is that they can be very effective as far as moving nitrate. We're redirecting about 30 to 50% of the flow that's coming out of the tile. We're now redirecting into the buffer, and all of the nitrate that's in the water that goes into the buffer, we're removing anywhere from all of it, or 100%, to as little as only 20%, depending on the soils that compose that buffer.
The creek that goes through our property that we operate meanders quite a bit. So from a farming perspective, we were having not as straight of lines, which slows down our production practices. So because of this, we were able to smooth off and make a lot straighter lines. It is some ground out of production, but the landowner is still receiving a payment, and conservation is being implemented, so we think it's a win-win.
Yeah, so that's a great demonstration video of the process to get a saturated buffer in the ground. Added bonus, that was Dr. Dan Janes doing most of the work describing the practice. He's now in the International Drainage Hall of Fame, so it's great to whenever you can catch some of Dan's presentation on these conservation drainage practices. You will notice on that video that they were installing this on a new buffer system, so they were creating more CRP ground there. That's why you saw that distribution line running through the actual field edge. So they were taking a little bit out of production to make this saturated buffer work, and that was the landowner, the farmer, explaining, he wanted to do that because of the meandering stream to straighten it off, and so they took advantage of that opportunity when they were expanding that CRP to be able to install the buffer before that went into place. And really then you get much better use out of that CRP area, because then you're removing nutrients from below ground as well as reducing what's coming off from the surface, flowing through that as it filters out the sediment and nutrients associated with those sediments. So while I'm talking about the summary of this, feel free to pull out your smartphone there and scan the QR code. Take a look at the assessment of your understanding of what we were talking about today. It's just a quick, I think, 6-question quiz. It'll take about 5 minutes there to do. But in summary, saturated buffers, once again, they utilize that soil carbon to spur denitrification. So it's not the vegetation that's on top of that that's responsible for pulling the nitrogen out of the system. We're not getting enhanced hay production or anything like that from these saturated buffers right now. Really, that nitrogen is helping those soil microbes process the carbon that's in the soil, and that's how the nitrogen is removed from the system. These practices are great. They are a little bit more site selective, and so you do need some gradient on that main, 1 to 2% grade, 2% or more generally is better. That way we can make sure we're pushing water through that system, not taking any risk of backing water up into the production area of the field, but we are pushing that water all out towards the stream. And then they are just very effective, very cost effective too, since they're relatively inexpensive to install. Iowa nutrient reduction strategy, it says on average about 50% annual load reduction is associated with these saturated buffers. In that video, it ranged 20 to 50%, which are great numbers. We're really seeing these catch on, and landowners are excited to put these in the ground if you can kind of present that clear pathway from when they're interested to all the steps that are needed to actually get them there. With that, I hope you continue to interact with ADMC. Thank you for your time watching this webinar. Feel free to reach out to me via email with any questions you have. Follow us on Twitter. You can always become a member of ADMC. If you visit our website, there will be a pop-up there the first time you visit it every year to sign up for a Conservation Drainage Weekly. And this is really a nice e-newsletter that comes out just once a week. We don't bombard your inbox or anything like that, but we do publish recent research publications in there, anything that's in the news about conservation drainage practices, implementation activities that are happening around the country or even internationally. Then also we try to keep people up to date on any events such as field days, more classes, more webinars on these practices, because we really do feel like educating the masses on these will help speed the implementation, especially if it is somebody that's interacting with a farmer or a lot of farmers in an advisory role. If they know the benefits and where these practices work, we really see that as a way to speed implementation. So once again, thank you for completing this webinar. I hope you take a look at our other 5 webinars that are out there. This was brought to you by CTIC, the contract that ADMC had with them. We appreciate it, help fund putting these together, and this will be a great resource for people moving forward. With that, we will